Hello and welcome to our lecture for week 7. This is the last lecture you'll be seeing from me, as we will be wrapping things up within the next week and a half. And this lecture, I imagine, might be a little bit shorter than some of the other ones, as home visiting is something I've done a little bit of, but not something where I have a ton of experience. So I will let you mostly rely on the material that's in the module, but I have some things I want to call out um, and clarify and just make sure that we're thinking about as uh, as I think the materials included in this module, while helpful and important, are a little fear-mongery, and I want to just make sure we're talking about that. So my personal experience with home visits, like I said, is fairly limited and was in 2 different agencies. So the area where I did my first practicum, which is like an internship when I was in grad school, and my first job out of grad school. Both of these experiences were programs where the family had to voluntarily agree to be in the program. These were services that the family had sought out, and for the first program, home visits were not a requirement, but this was a situation where it just made sense for me to go out to the home. And then in the second program, home visits were a requirement, but the families knew that going into the program. And I think this is a really important distinction for us to draw when we're thinking about safety and relationship management in terms of going into someone's home. You represent something very different when you're coming into the home of someone who has invited you there versus when you're going into the home of someone who has very little say over whether you're there. So in the first camp, we've got programs like public health nursing. The program I worked for was a Medicaid waiver program that was intended to put additional supportive resources into homes. And again, families were volunteering to be in this program. You look at things like birth to 3, which some folks might be aware of, but that's a program for kids ages birth to 3 who need some additional support in terms of speech therapy, developmental things like that. And so there's this camp over here of home visitors who are going into a space where they are welcome, they are wanted, and even if the housing situation is less than ideal, the family wants them to be there. On the other side of this, we've got those involuntary programs, and I think the biggest examples of that are going to be child protective services, adult protective services. You could even kind of look at law enforcement in this bucket a little bit, going out to do welfare checks and things like that. And in this second camp, I think we would be doing ourselves a massive disservice if we didn't acknowledge that that makes a huge difference. When someone has not been invited to your home and they show up and essentially all but force themselves inside, you're going to have a much different reaction to that than you would if you had invited someone. You knew they were coming, you asked them to come in, they come in, there's kind of a social contract there. And it's really important for us to think about what we represent in both of these 2 camps. And I want to talk about that in kind of a couple different ways. So any interaction that we go into as a social worker, a caseworker, anyone working in this field, it's really important for us to think about what we, as a professional, as a person, based on the way we look, what we represent to that family. It is not uncommon in my job that I go in and I tell people that I'm from social work and they clam up. They do not want to talk to me, and I have to do some work to backtrack and to unwind what I actually do and what I'm actually there for and what I'm not there to do. Because you bring something with you when you come into that room based on your job title. A lot of people associate social work with CPS. You bring things into the room based on being a professional who looks a certain way. You know, I walk into a room as a white woman and I represent something completely different to every family that I see, whether they're the same race as me or whether they're a different race. And so we have to think about things like that. Are you representing a system that has harmed this family in the past? Are you representing a race that has harmed this family in the past? And there's so many more things that you can represent for a family. And so we have to be aware of that in any circumstance, but especially when we're coming into someone's home, this is supposed to be the place where they can feel safe. And if we're coming into that space representing all of these things, it's understandable, especially if they didn't ask you to be there in the first place, that that's going to get a reaction out of people. And I want to call that out because I didn't really hear that talked about in the videos this week, as they're mostly focused on safety, which we'll loop back to in a minute. So we have what we represent to families, but then I also think it's really important, again, kind of in these videos where they're talking about safety and what you need to do to keep yourself safe as the visitor, it's also really important to consider what we represent to the area we're going into. A lot of social workers, and I'll use social work as an example, but we're talking about the broader field of case management, social work, nursing, all of this. A lot of people in this profession are young white women who, based on an area, may look very out of place. And I think, as we'll get into in a minute, I think this is where a lot of this kind of hypervigilance around safety comes in. It's because we're going into areas where, hey, maybe everyone in that area knows each other and they know they don't know you. They know that you're an unfamiliar car, an unfamiliar face. You don't look like the other people who live there. And so you represent something coming into this neighborhood as well. It probably means something to this family to have their neighbors be able to see you showing up and going into their home. It may mean something to the neighborhood as a whole. There may be other people in that neighborhood who've had bad experiences with people that look like you, or people who come from the same agency as you. And again, while we're not working with every family in that neighborhood, it's important to remember what we represent when we come into a space that is not our own. Excuse me. So on that note, and kind of with that in mind, thinking about the things that we, in terms of our physical presence, our agency affiliation, thinking of all those things that we represent for people and that we bring up for people, I do want to loop back around to safety, because I think the conversation around safety in terms of home visiting is one that I find a little challenging, and I want to call out that a lot of the safety measures discussed in those videos and in those resources are rooted in bias. And while there may be data to back some of this up, and I imagine there is, and I haven't gone out to look for it, and it's something we can look for if folks are interested, I do think a lot of the things that folks are protecting themselves against are kind of rooted in the disproportionality of this field and the way it impacts groups disproportionately. So when we're talking about, not taking your valuables into the home, not leaving things visible in the car, not wearing flashy outfits, we're kind of operating under the assumption that we might be wealthier than the neighborhood we're going into. We may look nicer than the neighborhood we're going into, and we may stick out more. And while those things may be true, they may not. I think it's important to recognize that this is coming from a kind of biased history of the friendly visitor and the origins of social work, at least, where wealthy white women were coming into impoverished areas and trying to make changes in families that were not theirs. So while I do think it's important to think about safety, and I think a lot of the tips in those videos are probably just good common sense for life. We should always be aware of our surroundings. We should always trust our gut if people are making us uncomfortable. While I think it's important to recognize safety, I think it's also important to be mindful of where those safety recommendations are coming from and how the history of the field does kind of lend itself to some of these safety concerns. That being said, we should be safe. I want to be very clear that people, if you're going to be doing this work, you should make sure you're following your agency's policies about signing out, bringing your cell phone, things like that. It's not uncommon for home visits to be done in groups or in pairs. I know, at least in Child Protective Services, it's not uncommon for two workers to go out to the house together, especially when you're new, but I think even on a more long-term basis. And So following your agency's recommendations as well as your gut is important. You are ultimately going into a space that is not your own. It's not familiar. And especially if you're young, you're new in your career, this can be really intimidating. Again, the home visits that I've done, even though I was there and people wanted me there, it's uncomfortable to be in a space that you're not familiar with, to know this isn't my home and I'm here in a professional manner. And whether it feels like it or not, there's a power imbalance between you and the family you're going to visit. Again, even if it's a voluntary program. So we have to hold all of this while we're also thinking about how we keep ourselves safe. Again, I don't think it's bad to follow these safety recommendations. I think, again, a lot of these are just good recommendations for life. You don't need to be bringing all of your fancy things with you when you go most places, unless you have a plan for keeping those items safe. But I think we're doing ourselves a disservice if we don't think about the way that the field's history relates back to some of these safety issues that those videos are identifying. So all that to say, there are a couple just extra safety considerations I want to throw out there that I think are sort of touched on in this video, but are maybe a little bit more unique, and really it may depend on where you're practicing. I think if we're thinking about, I guess anywhere, but really more rural areas, if you're working in states like Alaska, where there is maybe less of a separation between people and animals, or if you're just out in a rural area where people have dogs that they let run around, or farm animals, or there's more wild animals, that is something we need to consider. I'm thinking of a family that I've worked with historically that let me know that they do have a dog that tends to bite people that it doesn't know. And so this wasn't a case where we would be doing home visits, but if it was, that's something you'd want to know about. And you'd want to make a plan with that family to not get bitten by that dog. I think about another family I've met who lives in Alaska who say that it's not uncommon for moose to come onto their property. And those are things that, while they're unique maybe to a cultural area or an area or a cultural group, there's still things to consider, because we don't want to be getting bitten by dogs or trampled by moose when we're doing a home visit. A second consideration I think is really important to think about. I would say this one more in large cities where housing is really unaffordable, or with groups of folks who may not be able to access more traditional housing. So I think about this with the immigrant population, is folks who rent a room in a house with other families. I think this is more common than people might think it is. Again, especially in cities where housing is really unaffordable, or if people don't have the credit score to rent their own home, they don't want their name on a lease because maybe they're here without documentation for whatever reason. If they are not the only family living in that home, that's an extra dynamic that you need to be aware of. Maybe both from a safety perspective, again, because you're not going to know the other people going into that home, but also in terms of how you navigate that visit with that family. It's not inappropriate to do some contracting with a family before you go out and say, hey, I know you have other families that live in this home. Do they know who I am? Do they know why I'm coming? What do you want them to know? What are you okay with them knowing? Do they want to participate? Do they help care for this child? There's lots of ways to handle that, but it's something to consider, because it may be that this is not something that they want the other people in their home knowing about. And when we can respect that, we should. Excuse me. The last thing I'll mention, because I think this gets touched on a lot in those videos, but was not my experience when I was home visiting, is home visiting while using public transit, which might not seem like a big deal. And it hadn't occurred to me that it was a big deal until I watched those videos, and they're talking about how to park your car and do all of this. My experiences home visiting were in New York City, where I didn't have a car and I was 100% reliant on public transportation. And I think that adds an extra complicating factor to this, especially if you're doing these home visits in the evening when schedules may change. If you're doing them on the weekends, public transportation isn't always reliable. So, if a bus gets missed and you're standing at a bus stop for half an hour in a neighborhood that you don't recognize and you don't feel safe, That's going to feel a lot different than if you can at least get into your car and lock the door. I don't know how common that would be. Excuse me, I think I've been talking for too long. I don't know how common that would be here, but depending on where you live, that is something that will be a factor in how you do home visits. And again, I hadn't even thought of it until I was watching these videos. And I think while there are extra safety planning pieces that you need to do when you have a car, I do think that it would likely make for an easier situation, in a situation where you just have a little bit more control. So those are the only other extra things I wanted to highlight. I am going to wrap it up here. The last week of this class is really just a couple of days. I'm not anticipating there being extra material. I may include a little survey just to help inform my practice if I were to teach this course again, but for the most part, that's it. And it has been absolutely wonderful having you all in class. It's been so fun to dive into this material with people who I can tell really care and find this interesting. And I really appreciate all of your participation and hope to have you all in class again.